Tonight, the Nolan Wells investigation into the death of a shining star, Nolan Wells, has an altercation witness emerged. A witness that claims she saw an altercation at Horn Island.
Agreed. And it should go to the grand jury for part of their investigation. But I got to tell you, if I were cross-examining her, should this even go to trial, the first question I'd ask her on that 4th of July, what she had been drinking. Before that video got activated, everybody would want to
Wait, put him up.
Drinking and smoking. You know how many people were partying?
Okay, man. Have you lost your mind? And tonight, more rumblings that the wrong boat was searched.
The MDMR report states that the searched vessel was called a tied craft, right? On July 8th. But witnesses show he used a tied line boat on July 4th. In the MDMR report, right down at the bottom in the yellow, it says tied craft, not tied line.
What we have just heard is potentially significant, but it is also exactly the kind of claim that has to be handled carefully. The woman says she was on another boat near Horn Island when she witnessed what she describes as an argument involving Nolan Wells and several other people. According to her account, the dispute involved Nolan's phone. She says she heard Nolan demanding that his phone be returned, and that the argument continued after the group reached shore. She then says she witnessed what appeared to be a physical fight and saw a young woman attempting to stop it.
I have not spoken publicly about this before, but I witnessed an altercation involving Nolan Wells from a boat nearby. What I saw has stayed with me, and I believe it's important information. I have provided or intend to provide my account to the appropriate investigators because Nolan's family deserves the truth. Out of respect for the ongoing investigation, I won't speculate beyond what I personally observed. While I was on the boat near the area, I witnessed an altercation involving Nolan Wells and several other individuals. I saw what appeared to be an argument that escalated after there was a dispute involving Nolan's phone. I heard Nolan yelling for his phone to be returned. The argument continued after the group reached shore, and I observed a physical fight involving Nolan and multiple people. I also observed a young woman telling them to stop. At that point, I left the area because the situation had appeared to be getting worse. I did not remain long enough to witness what happened afterward. Everything beyond what I personally observed would be speculation, so I cannot honestly say what occurred after I left. Then she said she messaged one of the individuals that she saw, hey, I just want to say I was a passenger on another boat and I saw the argument between you guys and we'll go to the police with this information. I also have video footage. My husband doesn't show much, but it shows the argument that was taken and how you guys were upset at Nolan because of the young lady.
That from Secret Service Sam on TikTok. Okay. How is this helping the investigation? I'm trying to make sense of so many people online making comments. Now, if this is true, if there is a witness who has a husband with her on the boat and they took a certain amount of video, it could change everything, especially if the video is time stamped. Straight out to veteran trial lawyer, defense attorney Philip Dubay joining me. He's joining us out of LA, formerly in the public defender's office. They try a ton of cases. Philip, first of all, has she turned it into police? She said she was. If she hasn't, I give her no credibility at all. Look, I want this to be true. Why? Because I want the video. I want to see the timestamp on the video. I want to see, was he still on Horn Island at 4:30 when his acquaintances on the Triton boat left? I want that video. And if she hasn't brought this forward to LE, law enforcement, then it means nothing to me. I mean, if I know a young man turns up dead in the water, and I know there's a controversy surrounding this, I mean, we know she knows that because she's gone online and posted it, then why not hand it over to police?
Now pause there. If that account is accurate, it doesn't prove that Nolan was murdered. It doesn't even prove that the altercation had anything to do with his eventual death. But it could establish something investigators desperately need in this case: a potentially independent account of Nolan's whereabouts and activity after the point at which his friends say they had already left the island. And that is where this story becomes much more interesting, because buried inside this witness statement are several separate claims that have to be tested individually. Was Nolan actually there? Was his phone involved? Who allegedly had the phone? Who was Nolan arguing with? Did the argument really become physical? Who was the young woman who allegedly tried to stop it? And perhaps most importantly, when exactly did all of this happen? Because time may be more important here than the fight itself. The witness says her husband recorded some video. If an original recording actually exists, that could potentially be far more valuable than a social media statement. Investigators could examine the original file, its creation time, the device that recorded it, the surrounding footage, and, if the quality allows it, the identities of the people appearing in it. That doesn't mean a timestamp automatically proves the entire story. Digital evidence also has to be authenticated and interpreted correctly. But imagine what investigators could potentially learn from an authentic recording. They could establish whether Nolan was physically present. They could establish approximately when the recording was made. They could potentially identify who was around him, and they could compare that information against the existing timeline of the boats leaving Horn Island. That is why Nancy keeps coming back to the same thing.
I want the video.
She wants the video. And honestly, that is the right question. Not, do we believe this woman? Not, do we believe Nolan's friends? The better question is, what independent evidence can we find that either confirms or contradicts what each person is saying? Because right now, we're dealing with competing pieces of information. On one side, there is a timeline supplied by people who were with Nolan earlier that day. On the other, there is an alleged witness claiming Nolan was still on the island and involved in an altercation. Those accounts cannot simply be placed beside each other and left unresolved. They have to be reconciled. And there's another reason the phone allegation deserves attention. If Nolan really was demanding his phone back during an argument, investigators should be able to ask a very simple question: where was Nolan's phone at that moment, and what happened to it afterward? Digital evidence can sometimes tell a story that witnesses cannot. Location information, messages, calls, photographs, application activity, and other records may help establish who possessed a device and when. So this alleged witness does not give us the answer. What she potentially gives investigators is a new thread. And the important thing now is whether that thread leads to evidence. Because if the video exists, if the timing can be established, and if the people in it can be identified, then this stops being merely something someone said on TikTok. It becomes something investigators can test, and that distinction could make all the difference.
Okay. To Philip Dubé joining me, a veteran trial lawyer, defense attorney out of the LA jurisdiction. I'm not quite sure why you're so focused on who had been drinking. Let's take a look at the video. Let me answer that for you. Everybody was drinking. Okay, everybody had a snootful. So, even someone drinking can see an altercation, Dubé.
No, of course you can. I can see that crowd of people out there. It was a bustling, hot 4th of July afternoon. But who's to say that the people that she saw included Nolan Wells? And that's why you got to get into her ability to perceive and recollect being impacted by intoxicants such as alcohol. I would want to know if she had imbibed. I really would. Not to mention, the autopsy findings thus far do not reflect any type of physical insults or injury to his body. At most, what you have are signs.
I'm asking you about your fixation on the witness having been drinking. Joe Scott Morgan has already addressed the body. I'm talking to you about the alleged witness.
Yeah. If she had in fact been drinking, I do believe, unless they really have a video showing him in HD quality, showing that he was in a fight, then I would call her ability to perceive, recollect, and even state that there was an altercation going on in her presence.
Brandon Tatum joining us, Officer Tatum on YouTube. I've cross-examined a lot of witnesses, and I cross-examined them exactly on that. How far away were you? Did you know the target? Were you familiar with them? Was your vision obstructed by anything? Were you wearing glasses? Were you wearing sunglasses? What time of the day? I mean, I could go on and on and on. But unless you have a nun, a priest, or a virgin on the stand, or maybe Angel Gabriel might come down and testify, you have to take your witness as you find them. And I'm sure you've had a lot of drunk witnesses in Tucson, to everything from a bar fight to a murder to a dope deal. Look, I'd say a good 50% of witnesses were drunk at one time or the other. That doesn't mean they didn't see what they saw.
Well, from a law enforcement perspective, this is not cross-examination on the stand. This is us. What I would deal with a witness is right on the scene, and I'm not too concerned of whether the person is drunk or not. I'm not going to test their blood alcohol level on the scene. I want to know specifically, what did you see? What are the identifying markers that you have to say that this is Nolan? If the person can describe them, maybe we'll do a show up. If we have like a video or a picture or something, we can show them and say, hey, does this match the person you think that was here? Then we'll have a good perspective. But there is a challenge here, because you do have to identify him. You can't just say it was a black man out there with curly hair and I think it was Nolan. You're going to have some clear identifying markers that this is Nolan, and then you have to identify the people he was fighting with and the girl. And I think this person is going to have a big challenge. I saw this text message. We reached out to the girl on her social media. She never responded to us. I don't know if she ever really sent it in to the police, but it is problematic, in my opinion, if she hasn't. If you're going to say somebody is going to spend time in jail, or you are alluding to the fact they've committed a crime, and the fact now that we know that Nolan did not survive being out there at Horn Island, and you never submitted that to law enforcement, there's a potential that's tampering with evidence. If you have evidence of a crime and you're withholding that from law enforcement, and you knowingly and intentionally are doing that, that could be very problematic for a person who claimed to be a witness.
No. Morally, it's wrong. But there is no duty under the law that you have to report yourself as a witness, that you have to volunteer information. You can stand on the side of a pool and watch somebody drown and do nothing unless you have a fiduciary capacity. And it's not a crime in our jurisprudence. So nothing is compelling her under the law to come forward. However, interesting, she did post it. She did identify herself. She did say she was going to police, and that would be my first line of cross. Did you take this to the police? And if she said no, all HELL break out in that courtroom. If you have information like this and you don't go to the police,
Nancy,
fur would fly. Fur would fly. You ever seen a dog fight? That's what I mean by that. Fur would fly.
Now listen carefully to what happens next. The discussion begins shifting away from what the witness says she saw and toward whether she had been drinking. And yes, that is a legitimate investigative question. If a witness had been consuming alcohol, investigators would absolutely want to know how much she consumed, when she consumed it, and whether it could have affected her ability to observe and remember what happened. But there is an important difference between questioning someone's reliability and automatically dismissing their account. Drinking does not magically make someone incapable of seeing an event. At the same time, simply saying, "I know what I saw," doesn't automatically make an identification accurate either. That's why investigators would need to go much deeper. How far away was this witness? Was she looking directly at the people involved? How long did she have them in view? What were the lighting and weather conditions? Did she know Nolan before that day? If she didn't know him personally, what exactly made her confident that the person she saw was Nolan? And here's one of the most important questions. Did she describe Nolan before she knew he was dead? Because timing matters. There is a difference between someone reporting immediately or relatively soon afterward, "I saw this person on the island," and someone learning that Nolan died and then attempting to reconstruct what they remember from several days earlier. Memory is not a video recording. People can sincerely remember something incorrectly, and people can also sincerely remember something correctly. That's why corroboration is so important. This is where the alleged video becomes particularly interesting again. If the video shows Nolan, then investigators don't have to rely entirely on the witness's memory. If the video shows other people around him, those identities can potentially be established. If the video has reliable timing, it can be compared against the known movements of the boats. And if the video contradicts the witness's account, investigators have another answer. Either way, evidence wins. And that's the larger lesson here. The witness doesn't need to be a perfect person to be useful. She doesn't need to have been completely sober to automatically qualify as truthful. She needs to provide information that can be independently tested. Now, there's another point from this segment that deserves attention. The panel discusses whether Nolan showed injuries consistent with a physical fight. That is relevant, but we have to be careful not to make a logical leap. The question isn't simply, was Nolan beaten to death? The witness didn't claim that. She claimed there was an altercation. Those are completely different propositions. A physical confrontation could occur without causing fatal injuries. It could also be unrelated to Nolan's eventual death. Or it could become relevant if investigators discover evidence showing that something happened after the confrontation. So the absence of obvious fatal trauma would not automatically answer whether the altercation happened. And the existence of an altercation would not automatically prove that the participants caused Nolan's death. Those are separate questions. This is where an investigation has to resist the temptation to choose a theory too early. If the witness is wrong, investigators need to establish that. If the witness is right, investigators need to establish that too. And if part of her story is right while another part is wrong, investigators need to identify that distinction. That's what evidence is supposed to do. So instead of asking only, was she drinking, I'd argue the more revealing question is, what can independently confirm what she says she saw? Because if there is authentic video, other witnesses, digital evidence, or records that independently place Nolan where she says he was, the importance of her statement changes dramatically. And if none of those things exists, then her account remains exactly what it is right now, an allegation that requires corroboration. That doesn't mean we ignore it. It means we investigate it. Now, this is where the conversation gets much more complicated. Joseph Scott Morgan is looking at the alleged altercation from an entirely different perspective. Nancy is asking whether a fight occurred. The witness says she saw one. But Morgan is asking a different question. If Nolan really was involved in a physical confrontation, what evidence would we expect that confrontation to leave behind? And that's an important distinction. Morgan points to the absence, at least from what has been publicly discussed, of obvious injuries that would immediately suggest Nolan suffered a severe beating. He talks about the kinds of injuries investigators might look for on the hands, knuckles, forearms, face, or other areas of the body following a physical confrontation. But we have to be careful here, because the absence of publicly described injuries doesn't automatically prove that no fight occurred. It tells us something much narrower. It tells us that the physical evidence, as described by the expert on this program, does not appear to provide an obvious answer that Nolan was beaten to death. And those are two very different conclusions. A person can be involved in a fight without suffering injuries that prove fatal. A confrontation could also happen without leaving dramatic external marks. And then we have another complication. Nolan's body was recovered after being in the water. Water exposure and decomposition can affect the appearance and interpretation of injuries, which is precisely why forensic examination matters so much in a case like this. So when Morgan discusses the second autopsy, I think the important thing for viewers to understand is not simply, there were no injuries. The more accurate question is, what did the forensic examination actually establish, and what could it not establish? Those limitations matter, because we are trying to reconstruct events that nobody in the public knows completely. If Nolan was involved in an altercation, investigators would want to know whether the injuries, or lack of injuries, are consistent with the witness's description. If they aren't consistent, that raises questions about the witness's account, but if they are not inconsistent, that doesn't prove the account either. It's another piece of evidence that has to be compared with everything else. And there's an even bigger issue here, the cause of death. Because finding Nolan's body in the water doesn't automatically tell us how he entered that water or what happened before he entered it. If the forensic evidence ultimately establishes drowning, investigators still have to determine the circumstances surrounding the drowning. Was it accidental? Was another person involved? Was there an altercation beforehand? Did something cause Nolan to enter the water? And if the forensic evidence does not establish drowning, then the investigation becomes even more complicated. That is why the official autopsy findings are so important. Until those findings are publicly available, we're hearing experts discuss portions of the available information, but we're not looking at the complete forensic picture. And that's where I think Morgan's contribution is valuable. He's not telling us that the alleged witness is lying. He's not telling us that Nolan's friends are responsible. He's saying something much more restrained. If the physical evidence doesn't show the kind of injuries we would expect from a fatal beating, then we need to be careful about assuming that an alleged fight explains Nolan's death. That's forensic reasoning, and it cuts both ways. The absence of obvious trauma doesn't prove an accident. The existence of an alleged altercation doesn't prove homicide. The body being recovered from the water doesn't automatically establish drowning. And until the complete forensic evidence is understood, all three possibilities have to remain separate. So perhaps the most important thing to take away from Joseph Scott Morgan's analysis is this: the fight and the death are two questions. The investigation has to determine whether the fight happened. Then it has to determine whether that fight had anything to do with Nolan's death. And those answers may turn out to be very different.
Blunt force trauma, this is something that occurred underneath the skin that could have been from pooling of blood after his death due to,
Okay, I need to explain something.
I'll let the experts talk about specifics, but it doesn't appear that
okay, let's do
there is
that.
any
But I
blunt
want
force
everyone
trauma
to
consistent.
understand why Officer Tatum is here. Officer Tatum and Philip Dubé and others on our panel tonight are taking a particular side, right? It's called cross-examination, and it is similar to what happens in court. A theory emerges, a line of questioning emerges, and the other side tests it with fire under cross-examination. And then, hopefully, you get to the truth. Right now, we're talking about an alleged eyewitness to an altercation just before Nolan Wells is dead. If she has not handed this over to the police, it doesn't mean a hill of beans to me. But Tatum has a good idea, and that is, let's let an expert discuss it. To Joseph Scott Morgan, death investigator, professor of forensics, Jacksonville State University. You can see him now on a hit podcast. It's on YouTube, Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. Joe Scott, if there had been not a blunt force trauma that Officer Tatum is describing, but a fist fight, if there had been a fist fight, plus body in water for multiple days, body decomposition, would you expect to see red marks on the hands at that juncture, on the face? What would you expect if there had been a fisticuffs?
Yeah, you would see, well, first off, above discolored areas, like consistent with contusions. If there are facial strikes or just body blows, you can actually see abraded areas over the surface of his fingers. And these are very subtle sometimes. And if there is decomposition, which we believe there is, particularly per the second autopsy that was performed, he didn't make note of this. And can I go one more step with this? And this is kind of graphic, but people need to understand this. This physician that did the second autopsy actually did what's referred to as a coronal sectioning of the face. So there were multiple incisions made into Nolan's face in this autopsy, this second autopsy. And this guy didn't see anything. He didn't see anything that was of import relative or indicative of blunt force trauma. And I would think that if there was contact, particularly if he's fighting a group of people, these sorts of things, you're going to have injuries probably on the leading edges, or what we refer to as the blade of the arm right here on the forearm, the back of the hands, the knuckles as points of contact. And certainly if there's facial strikes going on with him, which we find with blunt force trauma many times with fisticuffs, as you say. You'll see these strikes. You'll see marks on the face. There's nothing to indicate that in the second autopsy. Now, what the state has, I don't know, but I do know this. I know they're saying they're done with the autopsy and that it's complete, which means the gross findings in the autopsy room, the tox, the histology, that means that autopsy report is complete. They just hadn't released their findings yet.
And speaking of that, Joe Scott Morgan, I've heard the same, that the autopsy is complete.
Yeah.
There are reports that there is no cocaine in Nolan's system. That's uncorroborated reports,
Okay.
but a good source. No cocaine in the system.
Yep.
Joe Scott, when the body has been in the elements, such as the water, for that long, how can I confirm if he had been drinking or not?
Oh, you can still pull a BA, blood alcohol, or blood ethanol level, as it's referred to. And again, Nancy, we're not talking about someone that has been down for weeks and weeks. We can still do the BA, and it can come from urine, blood. We can still draw urine and find it pretty effectively. You'll have what's referred to as qualitative. We've talked about this before, and I know you understand that, but so our friends understand. You have a qualitative amount, which they say, yes, it is present. And then you have a quantitative amount where they do the measurement of the BAC, the blood alcohol content. Just think about DWI, DUI, wherever you're from, those levels. And then we get up to those lethal levels. That's really what I'm interested in relative. And yeah, I'm interested in any of the other toxicological findings you might have relative to anything illicit or illicit drugs, but particularly with alcohol, because that has been kind of this thing that has been said over and over and over again. Well, let me see it. I want to know what the blood alcohol level was like. And historically, I would like to know what his level of experience has been with alcohol. As you well know, because of cases you've worked on in the past, Nancy, if you're a lightweight, if you've never had anything to drink and you start taking on copious amounts of alcohol, and you're kind of a neophyte in this area, it can have very, very lethal outcomes.
Let me understand. Joe Scott Morgan joining us. And tonight, more rumblings that the wrong boat was searched.
The MDMR report states that the searched vessel was called a Tide craft, right? On July 8th. But witnesses show he used a Tide line boat on July 4th. In the MDMR report, right down at the bottom in the yellow, it says Tide craft, not Tide line.
From Sam Crouppen to Ben Dobrin, emergency response diving instructor and trainer. Ben, thank you for being with us. What about the mistake in the name of the boat, if it was in fact a mistake? And could that explain any problem in getting GPS information?
Well, absolutely, because they're two different brands of boats. It's like saying, I'm going to search a Ford, and then you go out and search a Chevrolet in a car. They're very different brands of boats. And so if they were searching the wrong boat, then any information on that boat would be the wrong information. So if you're going after the GPS plotter on the Chevrolet, but you want the GPS plotter off of the Ford, they have no bearing. And so if you're searching the incorrect boat, you have incorrect evidence.
Now we come to another allegation that sounds potentially explosive at first, that investigators may have searched the wrong boat. But this is exactly where an investigative documentary has to slow down, because there is a major difference between saying a report contains a discrepancy and saying police searched the wrong boat and therefore lost critical evidence. The first may be documented. The second requires proof. So let's start with the allegation itself. The discussion points to a discrepancy in the vessel name appearing in an MDMR report. If the wrong vessel was actually identified, and investigators physically searched that wrong vessel, that could obviously matter. But before reaching that conclusion, there are several things we need to know. Was the vessel name genuinely wrong? Was it simply a transcription or naming error? Did investigators know which physical boat they were dealing with, despite the name appearing differently in a document? Was the discrepancy later corrected? Which vessel was actually searched? Were GPS systems examined? Were phones or other digital devices examined? And perhaps most importantly, did investigators themselves conclude that the discrepancy affected the investigation? Because this is where online discussions can get ahead of the evidence. A paperwork discrepancy can be real without changing the underlying investigation. On the other hand, an apparently minor error can become extremely important if it resulted in investigators examining the wrong physical evidence. We simply need to know which one happened here. And there is a broader reason this matters. This case revolves heavily around movement and timing, boats, locations, GPS data, departure times, phone records, witness sightings. So when a discrepancy involving a vessel appears in the evidence trail, people naturally want to know whether it affected the reconstruction of that timeline. That's a reasonable question, but the responsible approach is not to fill in the missing pieces ourselves. It's to ask investigators to explain them. Because if law enforcement can demonstrate that the correct vessel was identified and searched, then the allegation loses much of its significance. If, however, records show that investigators genuinely searched a different vessel from the one relevant to Nolan's movements, then we have a legitimate investigative question. What evidence was potentially missed, and was it later recovered through another source? That's the distinction between investigation and speculation. And I think it's important, because Nolan's family deserves answers, but those answers have to be built on evidence. Not every discrepancy is evidence of misconduct. Not every inconsistency is evidence of deception. But neither should legitimate inconsistencies simply be ignored. They should be explained. And right now, that's what this allegation needs: an explanation. What vessel was actually searched? Why? What information was collected? And did the discrepancy have any effect on the investigation? Until those questions are answered, the wrong boat theory remains something to investigate, not something to declare proven. And that distinction matters enormously when we're dealing with a death that still has unresolved questions surrounding its cause and manner. Because if investigators eventually establish that the boat records, GPS data, witness statements, and physical searches all fit together, then this controversy may turn out to be much less significant than it currently appears. But if those records don't fit together, then we have another piece of the puzzle that investigators will have to explain.
To Brandon Tatum, star of The Officer Tatum on YouTube, we just saw some video from your show, and I'm trying to figure out, among other things, what time and day, if you have a time and a date stamp on that, that seemingly shows the Triton with a lot of people on it leaving the island, leaving Horn Island. Do you have a timestamp on that?
I don't have the timestamp. I can ask them to see if they can get it to me. When I watched this video and they presented it to me, this was during the time that the CETO call was occurring. So it had to have been right around that time. You could see Wyatt on the boat on the phone. And so this is how it was presented to me. And just to kind of answer your question about the boat searches, it's partially irrelevant depending on the investigation and the interviews that they've done. There is no indication that there was a crime committed on any one of these boats. When you have 60 people that have already given statements to law enforcement, you have the young men that I interviewed that were on their boat that left the island, and then you have people that saw Nolan on the island after they had left. It's no indication that Nolan was on any one of those boats at any point in time and that a murder occurred on those boats. So regardless if they searched them or not, it was offered up for them to use a cadaver dog, but that never occurred. And so I don't really think that the boat situation or search is significant. The boys submitted their Life 360, which is how they got a GPS tracking of when they left the island and how they got from point A to point B, where they docked and all of those things. So all of the information has been concluded, or at least have been explored, and it didn't appear that there was any foul play on any one of the boats.
Okay. Officer Tatum, I respect everything that you just said, but to have a witness tell me it's true because I said so, and because my friends say so, that doesn't mean it's true to me.
This is GPS.
It could be true.
They
And I
provided.
see
They provided Life
GPS. That
360.
doesn't tell me what happened to Nolan. Just because they
No, I'm
got
saying
GPS,
they provided
that
Life
means they
360,
came back.
they provided Life 360. They provided the CETO call, and you can put those two things together and say, okay, the timeline matches. And if they left at 4:30, they were already gone. All three boats that came out were already gone when Nolan was last seen. So now you have a timeline that's
Okay,
consistent
right there,
with evidence
right there,
that they presented.
right there. I was going with you until you said the time Nolan was last seen, because their GPS data, I'm sure, is correct, and their Life 360 data, I'm sure, is correct. I'm not arguing with the technology, but what happened just before that? Where was Nolan when they're leaving the island? If you can place him on that island at 5 or 6 o'clock, please do it. And then I will turn attention elsewhere. I'm not trying to hang your friends, the people that you have interviewed. And I respect that you believe them, and maybe you're right. If he can be placed on that island at 5 or 6 o'clock, then they're in the clear. But I want to know who's placing them there, him there, and how.
Reports have come out that there's two reliable witnesses. TMZ reported on this. They said they saw Nolan a little bit before 6 p.m. There was also the young lady, Katie, who sent text messages to one of the boys that I interviewed. I saw the text messages where she alluded to the fact that she did not see Nolan get on the boat. She heard the boys yelling for Nolan to get on the boat. So Nolan never got back on the boat that he came on. So you have the boats leaving. You have a CETO call. You have testimony from everybody on the boat. And all of those things have to be taken in consideration. Also,
Philip, we know, because the district attorney has said she is presenting information to a grand jury. There are reports it is a criminal investigation. What do you make of the possibility this is a criminal investigation?
I'll tell you exactly what it is. Jackson County, Mississippi is one of the few jurisdictions in the United States that follows the old Sergeant Code. And what that was back in the day was the days of the coroner inquest, where if you had a violent, sudden, or casual death and they couldn't figure out what happened, you would impanel a jury where the medical examiner or the then appointed or elected coroner elicits testimony from people to try to determine manner and cause of death. What Mississippi did is they abrogated that and created this hybrid sort of coroner's inquest with grand jury investigation, where the grand jury will decide whether or not a death occurred and if there was a crime. And based on that, they can complete the death certificate with the cause and manner of death and decide if they're going to return a true bill of indictment against a suspect.
Is it your belief, Philip Dubé, that the grand jury presenter, and I have presented to literally hundreds of grand juries. That's one of the first things we would do in the Fulton County District Attorney's Office.
And finally, we arrive at perhaps the most misunderstood part of this entire discussion, the grand jury. Nancy Grace and the panel spend time asking whether Nolan Wells' death is now officially being treated as a criminal investigation. And this is where we need to be very precise. The fact that a grand jury is involved does not, by itself, tell us that investigators have concluded Nolan was murdered. It does not tell us that someone is about to be arrested, and it certainly does not tell us who, if anyone, investigators believe is responsible. What it tells us is that evidence is being presented through a process that can ultimately help determine what happens next. And that distinction is incredibly important, because there is a temptation in cases like this to treat every new development as confirmation of the theory people already believe. A new witness appears, murder investigation, grand jury mentioned, someone is about to be charged. Autopsy delayed, they must be hiding something. But an investigation doesn't work that way. Sometimes the absence of publicly released information means investigators are still working. Sometimes information is withheld because releasing it could compromise witnesses, evidence, or a grand jury process. And sometimes investigators simply don't yet have an answer. That's the uncomfortable possibility here. The public wants to know how Nolan died. But if the official cause and manner of death have not been publicly established, then there is still a fundamental question sitting underneath everything else. What actually caused Nolan's death? Was he alive when he entered the water? Did he drown? Was he already deceased before entering the water? Was there an accident? Was there an altercation that somehow contributed to what happened? Or is there another explanation that hasn't become public? Those questions cannot be answered responsibly by television commentary alone. They require the forensic findings, the complete timeline, witness interviews, digital evidence, and the physical evidence collected during the investigation. And that brings us back to the alleged witness we started with. Her statement matters because it potentially gives investigators another version of Nolan's final hours. The phone allegation matters because it could potentially be tested against digital evidence. The alleged video matters because it could potentially establish time, location, and identity. The boat records matter because they can help establish movement. The alleged later sightings matter because they could challenge or reinforce the existing timeline. And the grand jury matters because eventually investigators have to put the evidence together and determine what it actually means. But there is still one question hanging over everything we've discussed tonight. Where was Nolan Wells during his final hours? Because if the established timeline places him somewhere different from where the emerging witnesses say they saw him, investigators have to reconcile that. If the witnesses are wrong, explain why. If the witnesses are right, explain what happened afterward. If the video exists, examine it. If the phone evidence exists, follow it. If the boat records contain discrepancies, resolve them. And if the forensic evidence tells us how Nolan died, release the appropriate findings when the legal process allows. That's what separates an investigation from a theory. We don't need to decide tonight that Nolan was murdered. We don't need to decide that his friends are innocent. We don't need to decide that this alleged witness is telling the truth. We need the evidence. Because ultimately, the most important question isn't what Nancy Grace believes. It isn't what Brandon Tatum believes. It isn't what people on TikTok believe, and it isn't what any of us want to believe. The question is, what can actually be proven about what happened to Nolan Wells between the last confirmed moments of his life and the discovery of his body? And until that question is answered, the story is not finished.